Nantes, France. The 26th of October, 1440. A crowd has gathered in a meadow above the river Loire, and at the center of it stands a man being led toward a wooden scaffold. He is 36 years old. He is dressed well because he has always dressed well. And as he walks, he does something that stuns everyone watching. He asks the crowd to pray for him. He weeps. He speaks of God. Many in that crowd weep with him, and some will later say they had never seen a condemned man meet his death with such apparent grace. Here is what almost none of them can fully hold in their minds as they watch him die. 11 years earlier, this same man rode at the side of Joan of Arc. He fought beside her at the relief of Orleans. He was one of only 4 lords chosen to carry the holy oil through the streets of Reims for the coronation of a king of France. And on that same day, he was raised to Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors the kingdom could bestow, and he was barely 25 years old when he received it. He was, by some measures, the wealthiest nobleman in all of France. And now he is being hanged for the torture and murder of children, possibly more children than anyone at the time could count. Here's the thing people get wrong about monsters. We like to imagine them as outsiders, the drifter, the stranger at the edge of town, the man no one trusts, the one whose darkness is written on his face for anyone willing to look. It is a comforting story because if evil announces itself, then we can see it coming, and if we can see it coming, we can keep our children safe. But the man on the scaffold at Nantes is the opposite of that story in every way. He was an aristocrat, a national hero, a patron of the church who built chapels and funded choirs. He was the last person in France anyone would have suspected, and that, it turns out, was precisely the point. So how does a man like that become what he became? And maybe the harder question, the one that should genuinely unsettle you. How did he get away with it for years, in plain sight, while the families of his victims wept at the gates of his castles? That's what we're going to find out. To understand the fall, you have to understand how high the man started. Gilles de Rais was born around the year 1404 at the castle of Champ-de-Sey, into the house of Montmorency-Laval, one of the great families of France. His parents died when he was a boy, and he was raised by his maternal grandfather, a hard, grasping, ambitious man named Gilles de Rais, who seems to have indulged the child in nearly everything and disciplined him in nearly nothing. Through inheritance and through a marriage his grandfather arranged for him, Gilles came into one of the largest private fortunes in the kingdom. He owned castles across Brittany, Anjou, and Poitou. He commanded a private guard of more than 200 men. By the standards of 15th century Europe, there was almost nothing he could not buy, and almost no one above him save the king himself. And then came the war, and the war made him a legend. France in the 1420s was being torn apart by the long conflict we now call the 100 Years' War, and much of the country was under English control. Gilles took up arms young, and he fought with a recklessness that men mistook for courage, and that may have been something closer to indifference. By 1429, he had been assigned to the guard of a teenage peasant girl from Domremy, who claimed that God had sent her to drive the English out of France. Her name was Joan of Arc. Hold on to her because she is the thread that runs through this entire story. Remember her. Gilles fought at Joan's side through the campaigns that turned the war. He was there at the relief of Orleans, the victory that made Joan's name echo across Europe. He was there at Jargeau and at Patay. And when Joan led the Dauphin to Reims to be crowned Charles VII, Gilles de Rais was one of 4 lords given the sacred honor of escorting the holy oil to the cathedral for the consecration. On that same day, the 17th of July, 1429, the new king made him a Marshal of France. He was even granted the right to add the royal fleur-de-lis to his own coat of arms, a distinction almost unheard of. At 25, he stood at the absolute summit of everything a man of his age could achieve. Glory, wealth, royal favor, and the friendship of the most famous woman in Christendom. This was the road in front of him, a celebrated soldier, a great lord, a name that history might have remembered with honor. That is the man he could have been, Keep that man in your mind because everything that follows is the story of how he became someone else entirely. The unraveling began with two deaths. In 1431, the English burned Joan of Arc at the stake in Rouen. In 1432, Gilles' grandfather Jean de Craon died, removing the one figure who had ever exercised any authority over him. With Joan gone and his grandfather gone, the man who had been a soldier withdrew from the war and from public life, and he began to spend. It is difficult to overstate how extravagantly he spent. He maintained a household of hundreds. He built a private chapel he called the Chapel of the Holy Innocents, staffed it with a choir of boys and young men dressed in costly vestments, and officiated there in robes of his own design as though he were a prince of the church rather than a soldier. And then he commissioned a theatrical spectacle, a dramatization of the Siege of Orleans, the very battle that had made his name. This was not a modest production. The script ran to more than 20,000 lines of verse. It had 140 speaking roles and some 500 extras, and Gilles paid for everything: the costumes, the food, the wine, the players, all of it given away freely to anyone who came. Roughly half of his enormous wealth is thought to have vanished into that single production. A fortune that had taken generations to build, he burned through in a handful of years. He began selling off his castles and his lands to cover his debts. His family watched in alarm as the patrimony evaporated, and they were so frightened that they petitioned the king himself, who in 1435 issued an order forbidding Gilles from selling any more of his property. But the order had a fatal gap. It could not be enforced in Brittany, where the Duke had his own authority, and so the selling continued. And here, as his money ran out, Gilles turned somewhere darker. If he could not earn wealth and could not inherit more of it, perhaps he could conjure it. He became obsessed with alchemy, with the medieval dream of transmuting base metal into gold, and when ordinary alchemy failed him, he reached for the occult. His own priest recruited for him an Italian cleric named Francesco Prelati, a charming and almost certainly fraudulent young man who claimed he could summon a demon, a spirit he called Baron, who would restore Gilles' lost fortune. By the surviving accounts, Gilles took part in rituals, stepped into circles drawn upon the ground, and offered the demon nearly anything, anything except his soul and his life. No demon ever came. No gold ever appeared. Prelati, it seems, was a confidence man feeding a desperate lord exactly what he wanted to hear. This is the portrait that emerges of the man in these years, fabulously rich and going broke, a war hero with no war left to fight, a patron of the church chasing demons in candle-lit rooms. He had everything and was losing all of it, and somewhere in that collapse, according to the testimony that would later be heard against him, he had already begun to do the unspeakable. Now we come to the part of this story that is hardest to tell, and I am going to tell it plainly, without dwelling on the cruelty, because the cruelty does not need to be performed for you to understand it. Over a period of years, beginning sometime after his grandfather's death, children started to disappear in the countryside around Gilles de Rais estates. They were mostly young boys, though not only boys. They were, almost without exception, the children of the poor. A child sent out to beg for alms at the gates of one of his castles. A young servant lent to the household and never returned. A peasant boy seen walking toward Machical or Champtissé who simply never walked home again. One by one, over months and years, they vanished, and they did not come back, and the testimony that would eventually be given described what was done to them in those castles as torture, sexual abuse, and murder. I am not going to detail it. It is enough to know that it was monstrous, and that there may have been a great many of them. The number has never been settled, and we will come back to why. The formal charge spoke of 140 children or more. Some later writers pushed the figure toward 200. Skeptics have argued the true number, if there was one at all, may have been far smaller. But set the arithmetic aside for a moment, because the more important question is not how many. The more important question is how. How does a man do this, again and again over years, and remain free? And the answer is the most chilling thing in this entire story, because the answer is simply that he was who he was. Think about who these children were. They were the sons and daughters of the poorest people in France, people who had no power, no voice, no standing, and no one to appeal to. And think about who Gilles de Rais was, a marshal of France, a baron, a man who had carried the holy oil at the king's coronation, a man with a private army and the largest fortune in the country, and the protection of his rank wrapped around him like armor, who, in a position of power, was going to care that a beggar's child had gone missing. And even if a grieving mother dared to speak, even if she stood at the castle gate and demanded to know what had become of her son, who on earth was going to take her word over the word of a lord of the realm? The disappearances were whispered about. The country people around his lands grew afraid of those castles. The rumors moved from village to village. But rumor among the powerless is not evidence among the powerful. And so, for years the whispers went nowhere, and the children kept vanishing, and the man at the center of it all attended mass and funded his choir and chased his demons, and was never once made to answer for any of it. That is the engine of this story, and it is worth sitting with because it is not really a medieval problem. It is the oldest problem there is. The more powerful a person is, the longer the unthinkable can hide behind their reputation, because we do not want to believe it and the machinery of justice does not want to confront it. His status was not just his privilege, it was his cover. If you're finding this as gripping and as troubling as I am, take a second to subscribe, because this channel goes deep into the history that the textbooks hurry past, the real and uncomfortable mechanics of how people lived and died, and I put out stories like this one every week. So if his rank protected him for so long, what finally broke it? Here is one of the great dark ironies of the whole affair. It was not the murders, it was not the missing children, and it was not the grief of the poor. What brought down Gilles de Rais was money, land, and the bruised dignity of the powerful. By the spring of 1440, Gilles was nearly bankrupt, and he had been forced to sell off yet another of his castles, the fortress at Saint-Étienne-de-Mermort, to a man connected to the treasurer of Brittany. But Gilles regretted the sale, or wanted the castle back, and on the 15th of May, 1440, he did something reckless even by his standards. He marched in with armed men and seized the castle by force, and in the course of doing so, he laid hands on a cleric who was inside the church there, a man named Gilles de Rais, dragging him out and imprisoning him. Look closely at what he had just done, because the legal consequences are everything. By assaulting a clergyman inside a church, Gilles had violated the sanctity and immunity of the church itself, which handed jurisdiction over him to the Bishop of Nantes. And by seizing a castle by force and defying the order of his overlord, he had insulted the authority of John V, the Duke of Brittany, the very man whose protection had shielded him from the king's edict years before. In a single afternoon of arrogance, Gilles de Rais made enemies of both the church and the crown of Brittany at once. He had spent years untouchable. Now he had personally handed the two most powerful institutions around him a reason and a right to come after him. The Bishop of Nantes opened an investigation, and once the investigators began asking questions in the countryside, once they signaled that someone with authority was finally willing to listen, the silence of years broke open. The families came forward. Mothers and fathers who had buried their grief because no one would hear it now had someone who would. They came and they testified about the children who had walked toward those castles and never returned. The bishop gathered his findings through the summer, and the Duke of Brittany, who had his own clear financial interest in seeing this immensely wealthy and now vulnerable lord brought down, threw his secular authority behind the prosecution. On the 15th of September, 1440, Gilles de Rais was arrested, along with several of his servants and associates, and the man who for years had been beyond the reach of any grieving parent was finally going to stand before a court. The trial at Nantes in October of 1440 was actually two trials running side by side. There was an ecclesiastical court, presided over by the bishop and assisted by the Inquisition, which charged Gilles with heresy and with the murder of, in the words of the indictment, 140 children or more. And there was a secular court of the Duke's Justice, which would try him for the murders and for the armed assault that had started everything. At first, Gilles was defiant. He refused to recognize the court's authority and refused to plead. But the church had a weapon that reached past any worldly fear, and they used it. They threatened him with excommunication, with being cast out of the church entirely and damned for eternity. And for a man as genuinely, strangely religious as Gilles seems to have been, that threat broke something. He relented. He accepted the court. And then the testimony came. His own servants and accomplices, men like the valet known as Poitou and the man named Henriette, gave evidence. The parents of the missing children gave evidence. And under the threat of torture on the 21st of October, Gilles de Rais confessed. He confessed to all of it. He said, in words that have echoed down the centuries, that he had done these things following no man's counsel but his own, for his own pleasure and to no other end. He was condemned by both courts. On the 26th of October, 1440, he was taken to the meadow above the Loire and hanged, alongside two of his servants, his body cut down before the flames could fully take it and given over for burial. And the crowd, as we began, wept for him. And now here is the twist that a serious telling of this story cannot leave out. The question that historians have argued over for centuries and have never fully closed. Did he do it? I want to be careful here, because this is not some fashionable attempt to excuse a monster. It is simply that the closer you look at the trial of Gilles de Rais, the more troubling the proceedings themselves become. Consider what we have just walked through. The confession that sealed his fate was extracted under the explicit threat of torture and the threat of eternal damnation. The accomplices who testified against him were themselves facing execution and had every reason to say whatever the court wanted to hear. The Duke of Brittany, who drove the secular prosecution, stood to gain enormously from the ruin of a fabulously landed nobleman, and Gilles' confiscated and contested estates were exactly the kind of prize that powerful men in that age did not leave on the table. The procedural safeguards that a modern court would demand simply did not exist in 1440, and here is a detail that has haunted skeptics ever since. For all those scores or hundreds of murdered children, no bodies were ever produced. Not one. So which story is true? Was Gilles de Rais one of the first documented serial killers in recorded history, a man whose rank let him prey on the powerless for years until his own arrogance finally exposed him? Or was he something else, a spendthrift and a fool who made the wrong enemies, and who was destroyed by a church and a duke who wanted his lands and knew exactly how to use a confession squeezed out under threat? Most historians today, weighing the sheer volume of independent testimony from grieving families who had nothing to gain, lean toward his guilt. But honest scholars will tell you that the case would not survive a modern courtroom, and that the trial records which still exist in Latin in the archives are a document written by the victors. The castles still stand. The bodies were never found. And the question, after almost 600 years, remains genuinely open. What is not open to doubt is the shape of the warning. Whichever version is true, both versions teach the same lesson, and it is a lesson worth carrying out of this story. If he was guilty, then his rank is what let him do it, because no one would believe a poor woman over a marshal of France, and the unthinkable hid for years behind a hero's reputation. And if he was innocent, or less guilty than the record claims, then his rank is also what destroyed him, because that same wealth made him a target worth killing, and his confession was bought with fear. Either way, the truth was the casualty. Either way, power, not justice, wrote the ending. Reputation is armor. The more we admire a person, the more we want to believe in them, the longer we will look away from what we do not want to see, and the harder it becomes to ever recover the truth once power has had its way with the record. That is the dark inheritance of Gilles de Rais, and it is why we still argue about him, and why a man hanged 600 years ago still refuses to rest. And so I keep coming back to where we started, to Joan of Arc, the girl from Domremy who rode beside him in his finest years, who was burned by her enemies at 19 and was eventually made a saint, and the marshal who carried the holy oil at the coronation, and who ended on a scaffold as a confessed killer or a convenient victim, depending on what you choose to believe. Two companions on the same road in the same war under the same banners. One of them is remembered as a saint. The other became the model, many believe, for the monster in the old fairy tale of Bluebeard, the lord whose castle held a terrible secret. Same road, opposite ends, and the difference between a name carved in glory and a name buried in horror was, in the end, far thinner and far stranger than any of us would like it to be. If you made it all the way here, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. We go into the history that doesn't make the textbooks, the true and the disputed and the uncomfortable, the real mechanics of how people rose, fell, lived, and died in the ages we only half remember. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.